Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wiley Rein podcast on the Congressional investigations landscape in the 116th Congress that begins January 3rd. As we all know, after last week's election, that will be a divided Congress, with the Democrats having won a majority of the House and taking over control there, and the Republicans retaining and likely adding to their majority in the Senate. I'm Rob Walker. I'm a member of Wiley Rein's Election Law and Government Ethics Group and of the firm's White Collar Defense and Government Investigations Group. And as a former federal prosecutor and former chief counsel and staff director of the House and Senate Ethics Committees, I'm also a member of Wiley Rein's Congressional Investigations Practice Team. And I'd like to hand it over to my colleague on that team, Peter Hyun, to introduce himself and talk a bit about his background. Peter?
Hi, thanks so much, Rob. My name is Peter Hyun. I just joined Wiley Rein just a few weeks ago. I am joining coming from the Senate, the United States Senate, where I was most recently serving as chief counsel to U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who serves as the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. And before that, I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Civil Enforcement Unit in Alexandria, Virginia, in the Eastern District. I'm really thrilled to be here and looking forward to this podcast.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here at Wiley Rein, and we're talking about a very interesting and very current topic today. And as you know, Peter, coming from the Senate, a key difference between the House and the Senate as it relates to investigations by those bodies is that in the House, individual committee members have unilateral subpoena authority and power, whereas in the Senate, committee chairs must typically act together with their ranking members to issue subpoenas. So in that connection with the idea of subpoenas, I'm sure you saw this, a Democratic source, quote unquote, cited in an Axios article today, talks about the new Democratic House majority and presumably the new committee chairs there preparing a so-called subpoena cannon for the new Congress, like a T-shirt cannon at a Wizards game, say. And the article talks about there being 85 plus targets of Trump-related subpoenas. So a couple of questions based on that. The first one a little bit easier than the second one. First of all, do you think that the subpoena cannon approach is likely to be the new House majority's approach to conducting investigations? And if not, what areas, for example, first of oversight and then of private sector related investigation, what areas do you see the new majority in the House focusing on for investigative purposes?
Those, I think, are really good questions. And I think this past election was a clear mandate for the new majority in the House. All of the Democrats basically ran on this platform of serving as a check on this administration, particularly any sort of alleged abuse of authority, any improper conflicts of interest, improper use of federal funds. All of those things, I think, are ripe for the picking. And because the House Democrats already, for example, on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, had already been building a record as far as last Congress, where they sought to get subpoenas to the administration on a whole host of issues, including, for example, whether or not President Trump was involved with the procurement process with respect to the FBI building and whether he was putting his own personal, private financial interests under consideration with respect to negotiating any deals having to do with the new FBI building here in downtown. I think all of those questions need to be explored. And one of the things that I want to sort of highlight, however, is that while, it's really sexy right now, and I think the media is really spun up talking about subpoenas coming out the door, right at the outset, the fact of the matter is, for any sort of investigation, there has to be a record that is built beforehand. Fortunately, for many of these issues, well, I say fortunately just because I think with respect to the Democrats somewhat over-promising how aggressively they're going to go here, they've been starting to build those records throughout last Congress. But I think one thing to make note of is that even staffing up for these investigations takes an incredible amount of time. Mm-hmm. And so even, you worked, for our listeners, for example, who aren't familiar with Congress, When you work for a committee, sometimes, for example, when, and I didn't know this, coming to Congress from the executive branch, but basically when you're in the minority, you're completely under-resourced, and the majority usually has, up to 2 times the amount of money, personnel that they can use on anything. And now, once the Congress flips come January 3rd, that money is going to flip, and all of a sudden you are having to double your staff if you are on the Democratic side in the House. And that takes time, as you know, just staffing up and hiring, dozens of lawyers. It takes time, and figuring out exactly, the profile of the type of candidate you want, making sure that you interview them through all levels of the chain. And so this idea that somehow these subpoenas will be flying from the outset, I think it's going to be doubtful. But I think for those main issues for which there has been, a steady record built, that I do see it coming to that where, I imagine many letters that have been exchanged from the administration and from the committee members will start to come to the public light, where the subpoena threat will become very real.
What do you see as some of the main areas, and I'll call them substantive areas, policy areas, that the Democrats are going to focus on in the new Congress? There are the oversight investigations that will involve executive branch agencies and departments and cabinet secretaries and other leadership of the agencies, obviously. And then there will be probably no shortage of investigations into questions related to President Trump's finances, perhaps emolument clause related issues and other conflict of interest type issues. But apart from those, in terms of policy areas, legislative areas, what do you see as some of the industries, some of the policy areas that the Democrats are likely to focus on?
First, let me just say, I think it was really clever how Nancy Pelosi first came out. And she said, the 3 topics we're going to try to tackle here are infrastructure, drug pricing, and ethics reform. And I think that bucket of ethics reform, that she was subtly, sending a signal to the Trump administration, or not so subtly perhaps, that, hey, we're coming for you. That all of the alleged abuses, whether it's the FBI building, whether it's the determination over, making deregulation efforts, all those things that have potentially been, conflicts of interest, areas where the president may have been looking out for his own pocketbook or those of his son and his son-in-law or his daughter. I think all of those fall into that bucket. And so she was sending a clear signal that, Mr. President, while you have pledged to drain the swamp, that the swamp has gotten swampier and we're going to try to drain it for you. And I think that was the message there. But I think apart from that, some of the other bipartisan issues that I believe, I think what the Republicans will do here, and I think you saw it right after the election, is after the House swung, you saw Sarah Huckabee Sanders go on TV, and she said, well, now let's see if the Democrats are really serious about bipartisan solutions rather than, playing political games, trying to, the new word that it sounds like President Trump is using is harass the president. Let's see if they're serious about tackling bipartisan issues. And with that puts into the crosshairs some of these bipartisan populist issues that have been somewhat boiling over the last few years. One of those includes drug pricing. I think the pharmaceutical industry right now, you have bipartisan calls for the lowering of prescription drug prices. And what I think that will do is that I imagine that Republicans will go on TV and say, hey, we want to tackle this issue. We want to tackle this issue. And basically force the Democrats to say, hey, let's work on this together and let's devote committee resources to this issue. I could see the same being said about, certain tech companies and social media companies. Clearly, over the past few years, the social media companies, while previously I think they were the darling of, Washington and Capitol Hill, I think with respect to election interference, fake news, the moderation of possible, conservative voices, or all of these types of allegations about why and how tech companies perhaps aren't playing the right role in protecting data and also moderating hate speech and propagating this mass propaganda. I think all of those issues are sort of ripe for the picking for bipartisan lawmakers to join each other and say, let's do something about this. And I think for Republicans, it provides just the right foil to try to detract from the Trump administration, to say, hey, let's focus on something we agree with, which is that, these tech companies are too big to fail. So we need to regulate them. Or I don't know, but I could imagine that subtly in the messaging that these bipartisan populist issues may take over the focus of these investigatory committees in order to detract from the Trump administration.
And a bit of a plug here. I know you've written, and it's a really good piece on this subject of the potential for these kind of substantive area investigations to distract from what some are calling the Democrats' likely agenda in terms of oversight and investigations. And in response to those concerns, I know that there are some Democratic members-elect as well as current members and staff who have tried to kind of allay those concerns by using the expression, hey, we Democrats can walk and chew gum at the same time. I gather you think it's not going to be quite as easy as that. It's a much more delicate balancing game that they're going to have to be able to manage?
Yeah, I think so. In order for example, the Democrat, basically the entire caucus to say, hey, we have a really wide tent. We have moderates and we have really progressive leaders here. And I think especially with the specter of 2020 down the line, it's going to be really, really difficult to keep that coalition together. And what I mean by that is, it's very, very clear, even with most recent events, that the Democrats have a mandate to investigate this administration. I think even with the recent ousting of Jeff Sessions, there's a small part of me that thinks that even perhaps some Republicans might support Democratic inquiries into, for example, whether there was any abuse there with politically interfering with DOJ, just because it is such a dangerous precedent to not let that have been considered.
Right.
And especially by Congress, which is a branch of government that is supposed to provide a check to the administration. So like I mentioned earlier, the lack of committee resources, it's going to be really, really hard for Democrats, even, for example, those moderate Democrats who say they're running in 2020. And what are they going to look at, look back on their record and say, oh, that we cut some subpoenas for the Trump administration. It's been embroiled in, it's been in the courts, it's being litigated whether or not, we've overreached here. And I think it'll be hard for them to go back to their constituents, particularly in those moderate districts, and say, hey, we've accomplished a lot to help you with drug pricing, to help you with minimum wage. And I think with that in mind, I think Republicans are really just going to try to run out the clock and make it tough for Democrats to make the choice. Hey, what do you want to prioritize here? Because I think that's how they're going to message it.
Well, there's another way, I'll call it a time-honored way, in which investigative demands of one party in Congress against another party in the White House can get embroiled in the courts and kind of bogged down in procedural and enforcement processes. And that is, of course, here in a new Congress, the new Democratic majority's requests and demands for information and documents from agencies, from departments, from leaders of executive branch agencies and departments will certainly lead to invocations of executive privilege by the administration involving such requests. And resolving those claims, assuming they ever even do get resolved, through subpoena enforcement and through contempt of Congress proceedings and the judicial process, is almost as drawn out as this question, a drawn out and politically distracting process. So how do you see the Democrats in the new Congress addressing issues, claims of executive privilege in response to their demands? And won't such claims and addressing those claims inevitably distract from the agenda? And could they undermine the investigative agenda?
I think a lot of this will probably depend, in my view, and even, for example, in judging the political headwinds with respect to how aggressively Democrats will pursue this on the Mueller report. I think we all expect, for example, that the findings in the Mueller report will heavily involve possible obstruction of justice charges, which invariably include, White House communications with DOJ officials and FBI officials and whomever else for whom, the president might claim executive privilege. But I think if, for example, the Mueller report comes out and it's extraordinarily explosive and it provides a series of potential real problems of internal communications and highlights that, hey, there was many communications that occurred that not only broke norms, but possibly violated laws, I think then you have a real political backing for the Democrats to be very forceful in claiming that they're entitled to review claims of executive privilege. I don't want to get to, the big I word or the impeachment question, but I think everyone is sort of waiting to see what that report says to determine the next steps. And I think if the report does include some really explosive findings, I think you could see, Democrats being very emboldened to challenge claims of executive privilege pretty aggressively.
Mm-hmm. So, as you know, coming very recently from the Senate, as I'm sure you know now in private practice, congressional investigations and addressing congressional investigations successfully pose unique challenges for potential private sector witnesses, and I'll call them targets for lack of a better word, and their counsel. For example, congressional investigations can and really usually do entail letter requests or subpoena demands for extensive information and documents on a very quick turnaround schedule. They involve requests or demands for interviews and depositions, and at least potentially, there's always the prospect of public hearings. So having come recently to the Wiley Rein Congressional Investigation Team from the Senate, from the Judiciary Committee, what are your thoughts about what's the most effective ways that you have seen that private counsel address these concerns, congressional investigations, issues, and questions on behalf of their clients? What works in your mind?
Well, I think it's similar just generally as to what works, in my view, in a courtroom. One is preparation. And that entails, for example, knowing your facts and knowing your law. And you could get really jammed up if you start to make representations that erode your credibility before committee investigators. And I think because part of the process with respect to a congressional investigation is not only the legal process of did you behave, or did your client behave in the correct manner or in accordance with the law, but it's also understanding the dynamic of persuading various individual members of a committee. And I think what that requires, again, is making sure, for example, that you have the credibility that it takes to persuade people to look at, a set of facts the way you do. But once you start playing loose with the facts or playing loose with the law, I think you could get really in trouble. The other thing is also taking it very seriously. I think there are some who often, I shouldn't say often, but what I've seen, for example, is sometimes when a congressional letter is sent to a private entity and there's just no response ever sent back, or it comes some 6 months later, I think that signals to a member of Congress or to a committee the wrong type of signal, which I think invites greater scrutiny into your conduct or into, any sort of set of allegations that I think could explode at any moment. And I think the thing about congressional investigations that you really have to consider is the fact that congressional investigations, some can be, this really slow burn, this drip process where it's a multi-year investigation that's heavily fact intensive. Mm-hmm. And for that, you have to be prepared, right? You have to be prepared for the long haul. But there are also times when, for example, that there's just a moment where a huge congressional investigation can come just by virtue of on the spot. Say there's a huge product liability issue, or say there's a picture of somebody, being detained on the border.
Right.
It could just invoke at a moment's notice a huge congressional inquiry. And so related to what I mentioned about being prepared, I think right now it's also making sure that you become fluent with the ways of Congress. Mm-hmm. Understand where each member of Congress in a particular committee is coming from, what's important to them. Understanding, why they care about what they care about. I think because all those things help you prepare a response that's most fulsome, but also accurately addresses whatever, needs to be addressed to resolve whomever's concern.
I think you're 100% right on the preparation, the need to be on top of the law, the legal aspects, and the lawyering aspects of congressional investigation. But part of your answer also gets to the fact that congressional investigations really are a kind of hybrid investigation, and very much, skills developed in the courtroom and in prosecuting and defending cases are paramount. But I hear a point you're making is that in getting to know the members of the committees, there's a real and a very important government relations component to successfully addressing and I'll say defending congressional investigations as well, and leaving aside for now the theater component of public hearings. It is a hybrid kind of scenario. So clearly the next couple of years, at least in Washington, the next 2 years in Washington and on the Hill are going to look very much different than the last 2 years have looked. And the old guidebooks and the old playbooks won't apply, although the same kind of methods and preparation and approach will apply. I think one message here from our podcast, in addition to the great perspective and perceptions that you've provided today, Peter, are for the listeners, let us know at Wiley Rein if you have questions, more specific questions about navigating this new and newly active congressional investigations landscape. And thank you so much, Peter, for the Wiley Rein Congressional Investigations Practice Team. I'm Rob Walker.
And I'm Peter Hyun. And let me do a quick plug. We're also doing a webinar on congressional investigations where we'll be going over some of the limits and some of the more nitty-gritty over investigative tools with respect to congressional investigations.
And I look forward to doing that with you as well. So everyone, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Thank you so much.